First of all, I mean, I do encourage every student, wherever they're enrolled, to ask themselves early on some very basic questions, not just why they've picked what they've picked in order to get a diploma, get a job ultimately, but what is it about university life that helps them become more enriched individuals? And you know, my take on that is that it's a combination of awareness and critical thinking, that no matter what the student is doing subject-wise, they're hopefully becoming more self-aware, more aware of the people around them, more aware of the environment, and they develop skills to critically question everything, be it their subject, be it related subjects, issues of the day. And if somebody can leave an institution being a more competent critical thinker, I think that's one of the most valuable assets that a student can have. And why I think it's important for students to realize this early on is that some students get very rapidly demoralized, thinking, oh, maybe I've picked the wrong course, maybe there isn't going to be an instant job at the end of this. And a lot of students don't have the ability to sort of think laterally, that they're getting generic skills in terms of thinking, in terms of teamwork, that can serve them in a variety of jobs that they might not be remotely aware of when they perhaps start their course. You know, early disillusionment is something that many students face, and hopefully by asking some of these simple questions, they can perhaps address some of this. The other thing for students who are coming straight from a kind of broad-based, often a sort of Scottish higher background, is that they may not have enough statistics at their fingertips. And certainly for any subject that's remotely kind of science literature based, analysis of the literature becomes critical when these students are going through their course. And what I often find is that the inability to use basic statistics to tear pieces of literature apart really gets these students unsettled, upset, and stressed. So that good statistics, I think, is a very critical foundation for students being able to understand and ask the right questions. You know, certainly I find that in medicine, there's a great deal of rubbish out there in the literature, and if you have the talent to be able to decide, you know, what is rubbish and what isn't rubbish, then you're going to end up as a much more rounded, competent student. So having said that, positive mental health, there are systemic factors and there are individual factors. Systemic factors are things like, what is the living situation? What is the student support situation like wherever the student's enrolled? And I think that places where you don't have to travel humongous distances to get to your lectures or see your friends, that makes a huge difference to student well-being if things are relatively accessible. I think the other thing for many students, if they have a good student union with interesting things that happen, and if you like, a place where people can get together, that makes a huge difference to a student's sense of belonging. And especially in a disparate campus like UHI, the sense of belonging, the sense of being part of a group, an organization, is very important for students. And I know that most of the campuses do now address that, and they have a really good functioning student union, but there are still a few outlying satellites in the UHI network that perhaps still have some challenges in that area. And that might be something that can usefully be looked at, because certainly SAMS, I think, from my own knowledge, is the one location where they could usefully develop more in terms of student union facilities, and I think that would make a huge difference to their students. You've already mentioned, Ian, the concept that each student is assigned a kind of academic mentor that they can liaise with, seek help with. I think that's very good and very important. What I don't know is whether there's also a system of older students chaperoning younger students. I know that happens at some unis.
Yeah, yes, it happens. It happens within UHI as well. We have a mentoring scheme, which is overseen by a colleague of ours, Kevin Sinclair, and he's actually quite active at SAMS, interestingly.
Right. I think that's brilliant, because that certainly makes a huge difference, especially for students that have travelled a distance to enroll in a course, because loneliness is a big factor, along with homesickness, in students settling into a course and being relatively happy. But before I go on to individual kind of mental health factors, the only other kind of general systemic factor I'd like to comment on is quality of the lectures. You get a lot of very intelligent, interested, challenged students, and the only point I want to make is that charismatic lecturers breed charismatic students, and I wonder if there isn't already a kind of voting system in place of the student body for the most exciting lectures. Maybe that's something they should think about, you know.
Yeah, it's called the Teaching Awards. It happens every year.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, that's great. I didn't know for certain that that was in place.
Yeah. Students are allowed to vote for the most entertaining lecturer, the most engaging lecturer. There's a whole raft of titles that they can vote on. Right.
Okay. So when it comes to the individual student, a lot of the issues maintaining optimal health, from our point of view, seem like common sense, but you'd be amazed how the students forget about these basic things, like the balance between, you know, exercise, study, and sleep. A lot of students seem to think that the more they burn the midnight oil, the better they're going to be academically, and they fail to realize that that actually is the very worst thing they can do, either just before an exam or in general. That most of the research in retention of information does seem to suggest that if you give yourself a solid sleep, you get time for knowledge to embed itself, and you're much better at retrieving it. But year after year, I certainly meet students who dismiss that, don't accept it, persist in burning the midnight oil before an exam, thinking that that type of last-minute study is actually going to do them any good. And along those lines, I often point out this famous performance curve with students, the Yerkes-Dobson, that anxiety and performance are related in a sort of bell-shaped curve. So in other words, you have to be a certain degree of alertness and vigilance in order to work, to concentrate. But that if you tank yourself up too much with caffeine, Red Bull, and in particular now with students, amphetamines that they might acquire in a clandestine manner, at the early stages they think that they're getting cognitive enhancement, but unfortunately it's very hard to keep that in check, and it so easily goes over the bell, and then they become less efficient and more anxious and end up going into the exam totally spaced out. But this is becoming an ever more topical type of issue, because it's so easy for students to order things online on the internet, such as modafinil, which we use for narcolepsy. It's like a kind of non-stimulant stimulant, but it has the same effect as speed. And in a small dose, it does have cognitive enhancement as a kind of byproduct. And certainly in some universities down south, use of modafinil and methylphenidate is almost becoming, you know, mainstream. There's a sort of significant chunk of students that dabble in these things. And I think it's important for us to be aware of it and to share that perception of the risks with our students, so hopefully they can stay healthy. The other thing is obviously the issue of alcohol, that you know, students are away from home, it's often the first time for a chunk of time they've been on their own recognizance for such a significant length of time. They've got quite a big budget to handle with their student grant, which unfortunately gets doled out usually in semester chunks, which gives them potentially an awful lot of money to blow on booze at the early stages. So they need to be gently reminded and made aware of that, I think, certainly by their student mentor pal and by their academic pal. But failing that, I think students need to be reminded of safety strategies, that if they are going out on a pub crawl with their friends, that they should always make sure somebody can get them home safely, that they should never be alone when they've had too much to drink. And if they're in a university society, such as a ski group, and they go overseas on a ski holiday, they should make sure that there's a network of friends that always chaperones them home after they've been drinking, and make sure that they're safe. Because every year we hear these horror stories of students that, you know, pass out on a snowbank on the way back from the pub, and their pals have gone in one direction, perhaps still drinking. They've had enough, but they never make it home, and they get hypothermia, or they have an accident, this kind of thing. So I think it's important for students to realize that they all have a responsibility for each other to keep each other safe if they are choosing to go out to drink. Obviously they should all know basics like the unconscious position, to put somebody in who's, you know, passed out asleep on the bed. They shouldn't be letting their friend lie on their back or lie on the stomach. They should be in the recovery position. And I think every student should know how to put a fellow student in the recovery position from a sort of safety point of view, so they don't choke on their own vomit if they're sick. And I know these things are perhaps small print, but it's just that these accidents are so easily avoidable if everybody assumes a kind of collective responsibility. Because I guess at this age, between sort of 17 and 25, the commonest cause of death is in fact accidents, be it accidents like I've described, or car accidents. So I think it's important for students to be reminded of this kind of thing early on. So then we get to the issues of how can students stay healthy, perhaps who have existing mental illnesses of any kind. And what I would urge students to do is make sure they register with the student GP, make sure that they have a mechanism in place for having extra medication. Quite often what happens with students that are on pills is that they go from A to B to C and they forget their medicines. So I think before somebody starts at university, they should have an extra month as a backup of medication, so that if they go off somewhere on a trip, or they go home for a weekend, that they've got, you know, medication at home, medication in their digs, and they're not going to accidentally run out because they're going from A to B and forgetting to take their medication, because that's actually quite common. And people with bipolar, for example, it only takes a few days without your pills, and sometimes you're starting to unravel. So simple strategies like that to stay well are helpful. I think the other thing is that when students do hook up with a network of friends, it helps guard against this business of isolation. Quite often the depressed student will just stop attending lectures and basically not mix with their friends, sort of almost drop out. And everybody at home thinks things are fine. And then if you're not careful, half a term goes by and the student hasn't been participating in any academic work of any kind. And by then it's very hard to play catch up, because one of the things that I certainly am aware of is that academic programs are so intense, it only takes probably a month of missing material and it's almost impossible to play catch up. You know, you're almost at the position where you end up having to repeat a year. Certainly in undergraduate medicine, that's the case. I'd say 4 to 6 weeks, and it's an absolute miracle if you catch up. But I suspect there's quite a few other courses that would be very similar, especially courses that have got mandatory labs and practicals that you've kind of missed and can't catch back up with. So systems to kind of double check the students engaging so that they don't disengage without being spotted. I think that's very important to be aware of and for us all to kind of reflect on. And I think it's important for students to realize that we have lots of good treatments for anxiety, for depression, that don't involve pills. That if somebody's on the threshold of having a problem, they shouldn't feel threatened about talking about it because, you know, they're scared of medication or they're scared of being hospitalized. We have some fantastic treatments for early depression, cognitive therapy, packages of talking treatments with homework assignments. They can be very helpful for anxiety. We've got other ways to help people manage exam nerves besides medication, such as instruction in breathing exercises, transcendental meditation, which is a very, very interesting technique, simple to learn, 20 minutes twice a day. The anxiety relief lasts for 3 or 4 hours each time you meditate. tm.org is the national website for that. And actually, when I was a student, I enrolled in TM, learned how to do it, and practiced it myself. So, and I've read a lot about it, so I know it's a useful extra angle for managing anxiety. So I think it's important for people to realize they can go through lots of different avenues, and they don't have to just mean talking to a doctor and getting some pill that they're very suspicious of.